Point I would say, stop, it's a lie. We made this all up. But they didn't. They died for this.
This is one of the reasons the gospel is very likely to be true and authentic, is because here were people willing to give their lives for something they believed in.
The first to fall in the name of Christ was a young man called Stephen. Stephen was a deacon in the Hellenistic or Greek-speaking faction of the early church.
He was a servant, he was an administrator, he was to be a peacemaker, and ultimately became a martyr.
They dragged him in before the council. Stephen gave an impassioned speech. Eventually they took him outside and they stoned him to death.
Coming up, is there proof that the monster-turned-martyr Paul actually traveled to Malta and Rome?
This tragic martyr's tale has a peculiar twist. One of Stephen's persecutors, a man present at his very execution, would go on to become the most important member of the early church and the focal point of the book of Acts. He was a Pharisee from Tarsus, and to the early Christians he was the epitome of cruelty and intolerance. His name was Saul. He was a real flesh and blood man from history, and is credited with writing a large percentage of the New Testament. Saul's passion for the Jewish law induced pure hatred for the apostles and all they stood for. His persecution of Christians made him famous, and his brutal methods made him infamous.
He was known to the early church as a bloodthirsty persecutor. And Paul's biographer, Luke, also tells us the same thing.
To stop the spread of Jesus' message, Saul wished to shackle the Christians in chains and transport them to Jerusalem as prisoners. His siege would begin in the city of Damascus.
So he was traveling to Damascus and almost to the city, and suddenly a light shone from heaven all around him. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he says, "Who are you, Lord?" And he says, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up, go into the city, and it will be told what will be done with you there." So he did get up, but he found that he was blind, and he had to be led into the city.
They brought him to the house of Judas on the street called Straight. And then the chief Christian in Damascus, his name was Ananias, was told to go baptize him. And of course, Ananias must have said, "You've got to be kidding, Lord. Here's the chief persecutor." But then the Lord explained he's going to be my missionary to the Gentiles. So he did.
Baptized by Ananias, Saul regained his sight, changed his name to Paul, and dedicated the rest of his life to serving Christ. He would challenge the religious convictions he once fought so brutally to protect. But was this dramatic conversion plausible? Was a vision of the risen Christ the reason behind Paul's sudden transformation?
Something turned him around from being an arch enemy to this arch proponent of the gospel.
To explain why he would do that is very, very difficult, outside of some sort of theory of schizophrenia or some other sort of psychological problem.
According to historians, the reported locations of Paul's conversion are traceable to this day.
You can go to Damascus and you can still see the street called Straight. In Arabic it's called Darb el-Mustaqim, the straight way. They will even show you what is presumed to be the chapel of Ananias where Saul received his sight.
Through persecution and misunderstanding, the apostles pressed on, and in time their message captured many hearts. Churches began sprouting up all across land as communities gathered to worship the new Messiah. But still, these new Christians had some serious questions about Jesus and his teachings.
They need to know how their lives should be conducted, what their faith should be, and even though they've gotten this by oral tradition, it's good to have some written documents that remind them and reinforce them of this.
Sometimes there were big theological disputes that were raging in the church.
Paul and the apostles faced this problem head-on. crafting a series of messages that would become the Book of Letters. These ministerial missives would prove nearly as influential as the Gospels themselves.
The letters, the epistles, were written to answer very practical questions that were arising in the various churches in regard to how to live the good Christian life.
Coming up, ancient art is evidence of St. Paul's journey to Malta, described in the Bible.
As the letters and teachings of the apostles spread among the people across the ancient world, the seeds of Christianity sprouted. But for Paul, his fate would be far from flowery. Like Stephen before him, his tireless preaching of Jesus' death and resurrection brought about his own arrest, trial, and execution. But not before Paul journeyed here to the island of Malta, where, according to the Bible and historians, he performed some of his most miraculous deeds. In the Roman Empire, preaching Christ's message meant gambling with your life.
Paul was eventually arrested, and the reasons for his arrest are probably very complicated. Jewish authorities would have wanted Paul arrested because Paul and the followers of Jesus were emerging as a very powerful new religion and were threatening and competing with Judaism. The Romans would have wanted Paul arrested because the Romans remembered that the founder of Christianity, Jesus, had been tried and killed as a criminal. So Paul would have been arrested for what we would call both religious and political reasons.
But even as the cell doors slammed behind him, Paul's ministry did not end. He continued drafting letters and preaching the gospel to anyone who would listen.
He was able to speak with even greater authority, writing from prison, because now he was a prisoner from Christ. He had nothing to gain personally, but only additional hardship and suffering by proclaiming the gospel in prison.
Recent archaeological findings in Israel verify the details of Paul's prison letters, down to the very design of his holding cell.
And the two holding cells represent beautifully the life of St. Paul in Caesarea, in the prison. It was a shock to find it. It's a beautiful discovery, because it may explain how St. Paul was able to write his letters in the prison.
These ruins bring Paul's letters to life, confirming the description of his encampment and reinforcing the authenticity of his story.
The windows faced the street on the other side of the wall, which means that the prisoners got their food and supply from their relatives or friends from the outside world. And if you read the story about St. Paul, this is exactly the case.
Paul continued this cell block ministry until finally deciding to appeal his case to the ruler of Rome. This would send him on his most hazardous journey yet.
He appealed to Caesar, saying, I am a Roman citizen and I have this right to appeal to Caesar. And so he went through this appeals court and eventually was sent on a ship to Rome.
And travel wasn't exactly safe in this ancient period, particularly by sea. So Acts 27 has the story of a very perilous sea journey that Paul undertook while he was under arrest.
And while he was on this ship, a violent northeaster, as they called it, came down and caused hurricane-type storm. And so again, you have these seasoned sailors who are on this boat. They are frightened, they are scared, and they are convinced that they will die. But then Paul has this vision in which an angel tells him, don't worry, Paul, everyone here is going to live. So eventually the boat crashes against some rocks outside of Malta. Everyone grabs a piece of scrap wood, they paddled to shore, and everyone lived. And that prophecy came true.
While the ship's crew made their repairs, Paul began spreading his message to the Maltese community. Reportedly living in this cabin, known today as St. Paul's Grotto, Paul preached the gospel to the islanders who had never encountered Christian teachings before.
Paul takes advantage of his downtime, so to speak, and preaches and proclaims the gospel.
As entranced as the Maltese people became at Paul's words, his deeds astounded them even more. The scriptures state that Paul began healing all the sick in their community, and he himself survived a deadly snake bite right before their eyes.